Okay, so welcome again, everybody, to the University of Nottingham Asia Research Institute seminar series. This is the first of a few that we're hoping to have. There's going to be one more next week, and hopefully two or three more next semester. My name is Gek Chen Koo, and I'm the director. And I'm really pleased today to have two very interesting historians talking about Buddhist monks or Buddhism and Islam in this region of Southeast Asia as well as East Asia. So today we're going to have two short presentations by our speakers, Jack Chia, Meng Tat, and Sumit Mandal. And then they will have a very interesting conversation followed by the Q&A, and we hope to be done in 1.5 hours. But I'll just give you a little bit about the speakers. Jack, our first speaker, is an assistant professor of history and religious studies at the National University of Singapore. His research is on Buddhism and Chinese popular religion in Southeast Asia. He looks also at transnational Buddhism and Sino-Southeast Asian interactions. And his book just came out this year from Oxford. Looks very interesting. It's called Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across the South China Sea from Oxford. And he's also got various articles in Asian Ethnology, China Quarterly, Contemporary Buddhism, History of Religions, and the Journal of Chinese Religions. Our second speaker is my colleague, Sumit Mandal, who's an associate professor of history at the School of Politics, History and International Relations. And Sumit's work is about the historical forms of interreligious and intercultural interactions and their outcomes in Muslim Southeast Asia. And his book came out 2 years ago from Cambridge, and it's called Becoming Arab, Creole Histories and Modern History in the Malay World. So without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, Jack Chia Meng Tat.
Thank you very much for the very kind and generous introduction, Kate. I'm really, truly honored to be here. And thanks also to the Nottingham's Asian Research Institute for hosting this event. So I very much forward to one conversation with Sumit. And yes, this is my PowerPoint slides. Can you see the slides? Can everyone see the slides? Yeah. Sorry, can everyone see the slides? Or is it okay? No.
No, I can.
How about this?
Okay, you got to keep it there.
Yes. Can you see the slides?
Yes, it's good now.
Right. Thanks, Kate. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much, and sorry for the technical glitch. Well, my presentation this afternoon is entitled Nusantara's Dharma, Ashinjarakita, and the Indonesian Budayana Movement. The Malay archipelago, oftentimes referred to as Maritime Southeast Asia, consists of the Muslim majority Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, Catholic Philippines, and the Chinese Buddhist majority Singapore. Buddhism in Maritime Southeast Asia during modern times has little or nothing to do with the Hindu Buddhist kingdoms of Sriwijaya and Majapahit. The majority of Buddhists in present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are ethnic Chinese who migrated to Southeast Asia or were born to their immigrant parents in 19th and 20th centuries. My new book, Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across the South China Sea, is a study of Chinese Buddhist migration in the 20th century. It also tells the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Maritime Southeast Asia. I've explored the intellectual and institutional history of Buddhism in China and in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore through the lives and careers of three prominent monks, Zhu Mo, Yen Pei, and Ashin Jarakita. I demonstrate how the education, travels, monastic affiliations and interactions with the post-colonial nation state have contributed to the emergence of a field of belief and practice that I call South China Sea Buddhism. By South China Sea Buddhism, I refer to the forms of Buddhism in Maritime Southeast Asia, which use Mandarin Chinese, Southern Chinese dialects, and Southeast Asian languages in their liturgy and scriptures that have emerged out of Buddhist connections across the South China Sea. In coining the term South China Sea Buddhism, I draw on Anne Blackburn's work on Indian Ocean Buddhism. In sketching out an intellectual case for Indian Ocean Buddhism, Blackburn emphasizes the connected history of Buddhist communities in South and Southeast Asia. I find the idea of Indian Ocean Buddhism, a term that Blackburn used to analyze Buddhist mobility and networks across region, helpful to my discussion of monastic migration and networks between China and Southeast Asia. Monks in Motion tells a history of monastic and institutional connectivity in the South China Sea during the 20th century, which emerged due to Chinese migration and to larger forces of social political changes that took place in China and in Southeast Asia. In my brief presentation today, I would like to focus on the case of Asing Jarakita and his Indonesian Buddhayana movement. I will discuss his attempt to make Buddhism less Chinese in order to safeguard the survival of Buddhism as a minority religion in Muslim-majority Indonesia. Large-scale Chinese migration began in the mid-19th century and lasted through the 1930s. Most of today's Buddhists in Indonesia are ethnic Chinese who migrated to the Dutch East Indies during the colonial period or are descended from immigrant ancestors. The arrival and settlement of Chinese immigrants contributed to the spread of Chinese Buddhism and founded 7 temples of Klanteng between the 17th and early 19th century. Widely regarded as the first Indonesian-born Buddhist monk, Asing Jarakita took it as his mission to propagate Buddhism in the archipelago nation. His Buddhayana movement, which combined the doctrines and practices of Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, established an inclusive and non-sectarian Buddhist community in Indonesia. Asing Jarakita was born in 1923 in West Java, at the time part of the Dutch colony of the East Indies. He was given the name T-Bone An or Taiman An by his Chinese immigrant parents. This early exposure to Buddhism at Chinese temples was primarily through chanting and vegetarianism. Unlike Zhu Mo and Yan Pei, who were born in China, Asing Jarakita was raised in the Dutch East Indies and educated in the Dutch colonial education system. In 1953, T-Bone An was ordained as a novice at Gong Hok Si or Guanghua Si in Jakarta by Ben Qing, where he was given the Dharma name Ti Zhen. After several months of monastic training, Ti Zhen decided to seek higher ordination. After several months of monastic training, the lack of the required numbers of monks for the transmission of precepts in Indonesia, however, made it impossible for him to be fully ordained. Therefore, Ti Zhen decided to seek higher ordination in the Chinese Mahayana tradition in mainland China, but was unable to do so as religious activities were restricted under the PRC regime. Consequently, Ti Zhen was reordained and received his higher ordination in the Theravada tradition under Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma, who gave him the name Jarakita. After Asing Jarakita returned to Indonesia, he founded the Buddhayana movement that promoted non-sectarian doctrines and practices to be in line with the national discourse of unity in diversity. Asing Jarakita's Buddhayana movement conceptualizes Buddhism as a religion within 3 concentric circles. The innermost circle is the core teaching, or inti ajaran, and liberating dimension of Buddhism. The next circle is the method, which is varied according to the personal capacity and karmic circumstances of the practitioner. Finally, the outermost circle is culture or Buddhaya, which makes one form of Buddhism similarly different from another. In terms of practice, Asing Jarakita encouraged a non-sectarian mixing of doctrine and liturgical practices. On a personal level, He kept the Theravada precepts of not handling money and not eating after midday, and he maintained the Mahayana practice of vegetarianism. Later in the 1980s, he grew a beard to look like a Mahayana elder monk, but continued to dress in Theravada robes. From his personal practice and his appearance, it was evident that Ashin Jirakita wanted to stress that he was neither a Theravada nor a Mahayana monk, but a combination of both. Following the 30th of September movement in 1965, Suharto became president and ushered in 31 years of authoritarian rule known as the New Order that lasted until his resignation in 1998. Suharto's government blamed Communist China for the 30th of September movement, cut diplomatic ties with the PRC, and passed a series of laws and presidential orders to assimilation aimed at Chinese Indonesians. The government also promoted the Panchang Silat principle of belief in the one Almighty God, using religion as a force to counter atheist communist influence. To make Buddhism compatible with the first principle of the Panchang Silat, Ashin Jirakita introduced the concept of Sanghya Apit Buddha as the Buddhist version of an Almighty God. He claimed that the concept of Sanghya Apit Buddha could be found in the Sanghyang Kamahaya Nikan, a 10th century text produced during the reign of King Sindok from East Java. And he mobilized his disciples from various parts of Indonesia to spread this idea. However, Sanghya Apit Buddha was a double-edged sword for Ashin Jirakita and his Buddhayana movement. On the one hand, the concept was accepted by Suharto's government, thus ensuring that Buddhism continued to be one of the recognized religions in Indonesia. On the other hand, some of Ashin Jirakita's followers became critical of his theistic explanation of Buddhism and broke away from the Buddhayana movement. In Monks in Motion, I've explored the history of Chinese Buddhist migration, settlement, integration, and networks in the 20th century through two main themes. The first concerns the attempt to write a connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Southeast Asia. The other explores the role of Chinese diasporic monks in the making of Buddhist modernism in the maritime Southeast Asian states of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. I conclude here with some directions for future research on the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and in mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. In the first place, the evidence of Chinese Mahayana and Southeast Asian Theravada Buddhism, Buddhist connections discussed in my book reveals that Chinese and Chinese diasporic monks were interested in going to mainland Southeast Asia to exchange ideas and learn from their Pali-oriented colleagues in mainland Southeast Asia. There remains much to learn about the patterns of Buddhist circulations in the South China Sea and the ways in which modernist Buddhist ideas overlap with and perhaps facilitated one another. For the time period considered in my book, Chinese Buddhist monks fled communist China and supported anti-communist initiatives in Taiwan and maritime Southeast Asia. Some recent and forthcoming works have revealed that Buddhists became embroiled in the Cold War politics of mainland Southeast Asia. Yet little attention has been paid to the ways in which Chinese monks participated in counter-communist activities or to how they rely on South China Sea networks to cultivate activist ties and collaborate with state actors and like-minded Buddhists during the Cold War. Examination of the writings of Chinese monks in maritime Southeast Asia, along with Burmese, Khmer, Lao, Thai, and Vietnamese sources from the mainland could help construct a more comprehensive picture of East and Southeast Asian Buddhism during the Cold War era. It is likely that a further unpacking of the transregional history of Buddhist communities in the region would help us better understand the flow of people, ideas, and resources that shape South China Sea Buddhism. So I will stop here and I will hand the time over to Sumit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Sumit?
Just sharing my desktop. Give me a second. Okay, you should be able to see my desktop. Great. Thanks, Gabe, for instigating this conversation with Jack, and thanks to everyone who's joining us online to be part of this occasion. I'm going to be speaking about Muslim shrines in the Malay world. The term in Malay is keramat, and what I'll be offering through really a discussion of images, a way of looking at these sites as inscriptions on the landscape of history. So how does one read a history that is very much local but connected to very transregional flows of people, ideas, and goods? How does one try to understand this past by actually reading the sacred sites embodied in keramat scattered across the Malay world? And it's been a challenge for me to work on this, because it's when we look at how localized they are and how much they are very much integrated into small communities, cities in the entire region, you wonder how does one even begin to make sense of them? And I think I'm slowly getting there. And I have a few publications that have come out of this research, and you can look that up on either my academia.edu page or my ResearchGate page. But today I'm really going to focus on some examples of shrines really cutting across not just the Malay world as we traditionally understand it, but also a kind of expanded view of the Malay world. So I'll be looking at a couple of shrines in Singapore to start with, just to open up the discussion a little bit, and then on to Indonesia, to Jakarta in particular, and then we'll look at one in Cape Town in South Africa. I wrote up something of an introduction, which I'm going to read to you, and because I just want to check the time, if you give me a minute. Okay. Just give me a moment. We promised to keep our presentations short so that we can have a conversation and include audience members following that conversation. So I just want to stick to the time. Now, there are countless Muslim shrines that dot the landscape of the Malay world, and there's a valuable and interesting work that traces the provenance of these shrines to Sufism. So you might often hear of that. Sufism, an abbreviated way of understanding it in English is to call it Islamic mysticism. At the same time, the shrines may be understood more loosely as sites endowed with keramat. So literally, in Malay, the power to perform miracles. And the term keramat has become synonymous with potent grave sites, and its significance is reflected in its recurrence in the names of numerous places throughout the region. This power may be drawn not only from the knowledge, piety, and actions of Sufi adepts, but also the Hindu, Buddhist, and animist past. So I often see these shrines as really incorporating layers and layers of traditions, religious traditions. And a keramat also often embodies in the person of an outsider, a so-called outsider, whether historical or fantastical, frequently the figure of an Arab. And the shrines have attracted not only Muslims, but people of other faiths. So as I said when I was starting, I find it fruitful to consider Muslim shrines as historical inscriptions on the landscape. It's something to think about as we move forward into the images. What can you learn about interactions and tensions specific to these contexts spread out all over the region and expanded Malay world? You had slaves, convicts, political exiles who were forcibly shipped from different parts of what is today Indonesia to Cape Town. And these have left traces of a disjointed transregional history between these two sides of the Indian Ocean. The grave sites of some outstanding figures that emerged from that period came to be regarded as Muslim shrines in South Africa, mark in the landscape a history for which there's frequently little documentation. And it's the same when we look at histories of Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and so forth. I wanted to start by sharing an anecdote by a Singaporean who, when he was very young, found that he had a hole in his heart. And as we were walking to the city center, he tells me that he was fortunate enough to become healthy, and he's now, lived up to his 60s. But his firm belief was that it was his mother's prayers at the shrine of Habib Noor that helped him recover. So with that, let me show you an image of Habib Noor, the shrine. And I'm using this really as an opening to the discussion of shrine in Jakarta and Cape Town, respectively. And if you see the next slide, I'll show you in the next slide where it's located in Singapore. But what's interesting to me about this story that this gentleman was telling me is that it displayed a palpable reverence, even affection, when he displayed a palpable reverence, even affection, when he spoke about the shrine. And his mother continued to make offerings at the site long after her prayers were fulfilled and her son became healthy. The story strikes me because it brings the shrine and the memories anchored to it strongly to the center of the experience of being in Singapore. And I wanted to start with that because here we have, on so many levels, for so many people across classes, Singapore is this paragon of modernity, right? So without an awareness of the shrine and the stories of its extraordinary powers, its keramat, one could say, one would see only the landscape cast in the image of the Singaporean state's rendering of modernity. The Habib Noor Shrine stands as a reminder of other histories and sacred geographies in the landscape, though it's no longer in the prime position it once occupied along the coast. If you know the shrine, you will remember that the structure narrowly escapes the pathway of a major highway overpass and is now tucked in a strip of land between the port and the financial district. So if you can see in the slide here, the shrine is located right here, where I'm pointing it out now, and it would have been the coast, but now, as you can see, the land has been reclaimed, and there are containers piled up across from it. So the shipping containers that you see in the slide on reclaimed land literally cut the shrine off from its maritime past. The physical displacement of sorts of the shrine exemplifies a marginalization that's not always explicitly ideological or obvious, and could take a long time to unfold. Yet it has profoundly transformed the landscape and past tied to it. I'm using this as a way of thinking about reading a history through a physical site. So, this site has been maintained by the Singapore state, and if we visit it today, it's even more, has even more development around it. And yet, this site, this place that marks a sacred geography, and it marks a connection, a transregional connection across the Indian Ocean to Yemen, because the person who's buried here is a person of Arab descent, Habib Noor himself. So there are various things we could discuss about why the Singapore state continues to respect this site, but I think for our current purposes, I just want to give you a sense of the way in which I'm doing this work. One element of it, which is why these shrines scattered across an expanded view of the Malay world, could reveal very interesting histories. And what you have literally with the reclamation of the land and where you see the containers is a way by which, not necessarily by very explicit choice, a history of maritime connections is literally, paved over, right? But the site is there to remind us, the site is there to help us rethink the past and see Singapore also as part of that older maritime history as well. So more is known about Habib Noor than many other keramat. Typically, the venerated grave sites mark the life of an individual who distinguished himself in some way, but about whom little is known. They propose the existence of individuals who played an important role in numerous communities, but whose historical inscription and whose historical significance often ends there. The grave sites are thus a historical inscription on the landscape that are potentially challenging, but also very illuminating. So I'm going to now, using that as an introduction, talk about two particular areas. And the first is, here's a little bit more of a view of the site in Singapore. As you can see, it's very much more inland now than it would have been in the past along the coast. But let us move on to Luar Batang, which is a keramat in Jakarta. And it's an area that's today, again, once located by the sea, but here not really because of development, but because of the accumulation of silt. Jakarta, as you know, is sinking. It's undergone a great deal of flooding over the years, causing a lot of misery to many people. And in fact, it's one of the reasons the capital is being moved to Kalimantan. Of course, that's a very long-term project. But this shrine was once a very significant site on the coast, but it no longer is today because of the silting, because of also the accumulation of rubbish. So there's kind of environmental damage taking place there. And it's in a very a poor part of Jakarta today. And it's also, in a state of disrepair. Now, the figure who's buried here is a man called Syed Hussein Al Idrus. Again, somebody who is connected to Yemen, connected to specifically to communities of Hadramis, and even more specifically to people of prophetic descent, right? Descent from the Prophet Muhammad. And people who spread all over the Indian Ocean region, from East Africa to the Malay world. And he was buried here in the early 18th century. And while the site is marginal to contemporary Indonesian national history, contemporary Jakarta history, but it's embedded in a dynamic transregional history, which today involves pilgrimage, for instance, within Java, as well as Muslims from around the region who gather there, especially on feast days. And the image that you see before you is a hagiography. It basically tells you of all the miracles that this saint has performed. The person buried in this site has performed over the years. And I'm going to show you one more image now of the. You can't actually see the shrine itself. It's inside a curtain. It's opened only on special occasions. And I just want to share with you a couple of ways by which its history in this part of Luar Batang of Jakarta is very important. When he died, the idea was proposed that his body be removed, and he was moved to a nicer part of Jakarta to be to a cemetery, a Muslim cemetery. And one of the early sort of miraculous events was that his body was found once again back in Batang, where he spent a great deal of time, where he worked with the community and the Muslim community. And so, they tried this repeatedly, but his body would keep going back to the site. So one of the things I want to show with that story is a linkage that's very, very local, very rooted. So it's not about a kind of Islam that is transcended, that moves, that is moving from any city in the world, right? You could go to a mosque, you could perform your prayers. This is an idea about Muslim practice that is located in space. But the second story I want to relate has to do with him being coming into some money, which is in the form of gold coins, and the community gathers around him, and they find it very odd that he's throwing the money in sacks into the sea. And then when asked, he says, well, I'm sending this to my mother back in Yemen. And the idea of connections through the sea are almost literal. There are deeply Sufistic, mystical norms underlying some of these ideas, but I'm going to really leave it at that and move on so that we have some time for conversation and discussion later. I think my purpose for now is just to show you some examples and the types of miracles and histories associated with them. We're going to move on now across the Indian Ocean to a keramat in Cape Town, which is called Tuan Guru. And this is at the top of a very pretty site, a hilltop site in Cape Town. You will see this gate. It's the gateway to the Tanah Baru Cemetery. So those of you who speak Malay will see the Malay words Tanah Baru there. And yeah, it's new land, and it's a Muslim cemetery that has a long history, and it's very meaningful to Cape Muslims, to South African history. And a man named a man who was referred to as Tuan Guru, as a respected teacher, is buried here. And his name was Abdullah Qadi Abdul Salam, and he was from the eastern part of what is Indonesia today. And Tuan Guru is the respectful form of address for a religious scholar. And he was exiled to Cape Town like other Muslims who were considered troublemakers by the Dutch East India Company. And in Cape Town, he wrote a book on Islamic law and reproduced the Quran from memory. So he contributed enormously to the spread of Islam in the area by establishing the first Muslim school, admitting slaves and free blacks as students, before building the first mosque in the 1790s. So you have a connection to the Malay Muslim world, between the Malay Muslim world of Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore to contemporary South Africa through this very transregional historical linkage. So many of the institutions that Tuan Guru created continue to exist. This is the actual gravesite that you see once you go through those gates, and different views of it. You can see the famous Table Mountain in the background. The city of Cape Town unfolds before you. The numerous miracles that are associated with Tuan Guru. In one instance, he leaves, he's said to have been seen after his death, obviously, on an island called Robben Island. That island was famous as an apartheid prison island. It was where Nelson Mandela was locked up for many, many years. And Tuan Guru was found there assisting a Muslim who was also, not during Nelson Mandela's time, much earlier, and a Muslim who was also held captive there. And Tuan Guru crossed over the sea to the island to assist him. And, many other stories circulate about him and the site. And I will leave it at that and read a concluding statement, because I think what I'd really like to do is just leave you with a taste, a very rough idea of how I'm reading, how in my research I'm reading history through sites inscribed in the land, also history in the ground. And we've looked at 3 sites, Singapore as an introduction, and then Luar Batang in Jakarta, and now before you is an image of Tuan Guru in Cape Town. But just a paragraph to conclude. One of the ways I think I'd like to wrap up is to talk about the persistence of the popular veneration of shrines, right, under vastly different historical conditions. So shrines are for the most part no longer so central to the lives of major cities or nation states. And you can see even in this image, it's in a state of disrepair, the shrine in Cape Town, but that's often the case in other instances as well. It's an indication of how what were once central histories are really, that logic has moved on. So the center of history now is at the bottom of the hill. Again, in Cape Town is the financial district that you overlook from where you're standing on this site. So the shrines are far from central to the life of major cities. Seldom would they appear on an official tourist map, for instance. Yet, as we have seen, they remain significant in particular and not insignificant orbits. They remain present because many people either continue to pay respect to them, venerate them. Some also do what is contentious in Islam, which is pray at the gravesite. It's okay to be reading Quranic verses to respect the dead, but what's contentious is when people actually make offerings to these gravesites. So their persistence is noteworthy for a number of reasons. Firstly, the localized and transregional character of many shrines respectively allow for narratives that lie inside and beyond the nation state. So they are about very much local, urban, national histories, but they're also very much connected to distant parts of the world. The inscriptions of a sacred geography that may be quite flexible, a sacred geography that may possess quite flexible historical connections of many shrines, right, allow different narratives about them. So there are many stories that could be told about the local, national, and transregional connections around these shrines. Secondly, they would no longer be around if it was simply a matter of an insistence on their age and importance. So that's not what's keeping them around. In my view, the shrines persist because of the reproduction and renewal of the narrative surrounding them. So in one way or another, stories circulate about either their power, their historical significance, and their frequently popular narratives. They are thus dynamic rather than static inscriptions in the landscape. Studying shrines, it would appear, could reveal shifts in Muslim societies that are not necessarily visible by viewing them through the lens of the nation state. So let me stop there. Thank you.
So we have a bit of time for both of you to have this conversation.
Yes. So
Great.
I'm just stopping my sharing. Okay. So we had a few questions that we had in mind, right? We might talk about.
Yeah. So shall we start with the first question?
Sure.
Yeah, that we prepared about the relationship between migration and diaspora, and also the relationship between migration and religious belief and practices. So
yeah, both our talks deal with migration and diaspora on some level. Mine deal with an older diaspora which continues to have some forms of mobility and interaction, but I'm looking at the kind of historical inscriptions of an earlier moment in their mobility. Whereas you, Jack,
yeah, I'm more interested in the more kind of institutional intellectual form of Buddhism that emerged because of the migration in the 19th and 20th century to Southeast Asia. So I think it's interesting that we both have, in a way, common themes that cover both issues of migration and diaspora, in the sense that how migration and how the diasporic community contributed to the emergence of new religious ideas and practices in maritime Southeast Asia, and how these ideas continue to be relevant to many people today. So I thought this is something really interesting to think about.
One of the things that the shrines have done for me is they are an inscription of an older history that people refer to when they are kind of rediscovering their connections to, say, for instance, when in this region, when I think of the Malay world, it's an expanded Malay world, so it includes the Cape Town. It's obviously not an ethnicity-based idea. It's about the kinds of connections historically, in my case, through keramat. But what these linkages often do is they are allow communities like contemporary Hadramis to locate themselves as they are rediscovering. There's been a process of rediscovery from the 90s, since the end of the Cold War, when Yemen became, well, Yemen was previous to that a Marxist republic, and it had strong ties to the Soviet Union. And so there was travel between Indonesia and Yemen was not easy. But since the end of the Cold War, there's been more travel. And so people who had long since not had ties with the homes of their parents or grandparents, rather, were rediscovering their ties. And some of the sites that we're looking at were reference points or of an older history, that hasn't been erased from major cities like Singapore, Jakarta, Penang.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sumit, I think what is so fascinating about the case of Tuan Guru is that how we see Indonesia as a new center, new site in terms of Islamic practices and ideas, where how, as you mentioned in the presentation, how Tuan Guru was actually from Dutch East Indies and he was exiled to Africa. So we see this very interesting kind of flow as well, how the Arabs started in the Middle East, went to Southeast Asia, and then how they were exiled from Southeast Asia, and then they made new kind of religious ideas and kind of practices in other places. So I thought this is something that is also interesting to think about, how we can think about transnational religion with as a kind of very multi-centered kind of way, rather than just looking at just a core of just like the Middle East, or when we think about Chinese Buddhism, when we think about China, mainland China as the center for Chinese Buddhism, where how we see the kind of modern period because of this transnational kind of migration and networks, where how we see new cores and new kind of centers that have emerged because of that movement.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really helpful idea, right? Thank you for opening that up, because one of the things that we suffer in looking at the Southeast Asia, at least, is that it's now an outdated idea, but in the past, this region was seen as a kind of inferior civilization in relation to China, India, and of course the source of Islam, Arabia, because everything was a sort of hybrid derivative of China and India, and the term that was used was Indochina. And no one talks in that way anymore. But one of the sort of foundations of that was that civilizations have core centers. So if you're Hindu in Java, obviously, your core was in India. But the type of work you were doing, Jack, as well as Andreas Akri, who's doing work on Buddhist connections from Java and Sumatra with India, that is now sort of changing our understanding of religious traditions. So we don't necessarily look for particular cause. And so, when we look at Islam, so much of what is very dynamic and interesting, I'm not saying that it's not coming out of Arabic-speaking countries, but a lot that's going on that is sort of engagements with modernity that are taking place in Indonesia are, for instance, very significant in Islam. And the example of South Africa is a great one, because in South Africa, Islam, people become Muslim through their connection to what we call Southeast Asia today. So Southern Africa has a different connection to Islam than Northern Africa. So Northern Africa became Muslim soon after, in the initial centuries of the beginnings of Islam. But South Africa becomes Muslim in the middle of the last millennium through connections with Southeast Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. So very much related to that, I remember our second question is about this idea of thinking about religion in maritime Southeast Asia as being very mobile and fluid, and about how it's important to think about religion beyond this kind of nation-based kind of boundary, to think about this kind of global transregional connection. And I think something very fascinating that you raised in your presentation is about this idea of the maritime connection, the sea, where about how people toss money into the sea. And I think this is also something which I find in a way very much connected to my own work, when I look at this kind of South China Sea Buddhism, or M. Blackburn's work on Indian Ocean Buddhism, and how we can think about religion in a kind of very oceanic, maritime type of connection, rather than thinking about it in just a very land kind of nation-based kind of approach. So I wonder, how should we, look at kind of maritime religion in this case, especially if we think about it comparatively across different kind of religious traditions?
Yeah, no, maritime traditions are very much tied to the stories around the keramats, around the migrations of people, and sometimes they are motifs that get repeated across religious traditions. So one really famous figure is a man called Sheikh Yusuf, who was already a very well-known Islamic scholar in Java when the Dutch exiled him to Cape Town. And as they were running out of water, again, stories around the water, stories about how people made it across the sea were very important. And in one of those stories, they are nearly in South Africa and they run out of fresh water. And what Sheikh Yusuf does is he dips his toes into the sea, and the area around where he dips his toes becomes fresh water. People drink it and they survive that long sea journey. There's so much in that story. But what I also wanted to relate to you is I was talking to a taxi driver who is Buddhist, who told me of a Buddhist story of a monk that was exactly the same, but connected to a journey from Malacca to southern Thailand or something like that, So some of these motifs about the difficulties about crossing the sea, overcoming them through miracles, again, cross-religious traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the trope of the kind of maritime of the sea is something quite prominent as well. When we look at kind of a Chinese religious studies, in the kind of Buddhist context, we often talk about the Guanyin as kind of the protector of the seafarers, and how the Guanyin often stated in many the Avalokiteshvara were emancipated in various different forms to to protect seafarers. But it's also kind of similar kind of traditions as well in other Chinese religious traditions, such as like the worship of Maju as the kind of goddess of the sea. And from my earlier research, I think on Tua Pei Gong is also something quite kind of prominent as well in the kind of maritime Southeast Asian context. For instance, there's a very popular kind of Tua Pei Gong temple in Penang, and also there's a Tope Gong temple in Singapore's Kusu Island as well, and how a lot of Southeast Asian Chinese believe that how Tope Gong is also kind of a god of kind of a patron saints of the seafarers. But also at the same time, he also served as a kind of a god of fortune as well. So that's why he's so popular among the kind of overseas Chinese communities.
And the Tope Gong in Kusu Island is colored yellow, which is again very much a very ancient color of sacredness in this part of the world. It's both Malay, it's Buddhist. The Thai king, is also connected to yellowness, and that actually raises one of the questions that we had, which was hybrid religion. How do we deal with hybrid religious phenomena, right? So much of religious traditions across the board. In our earlier conversations, we found not only in Islam but in Buddhism become hybrid. And how frequently the attention is on Islam, because in both Malaysia and Indonesia, for instance, there's strong bureaucratic efforts, at least to control bureaucratically practices that veer from the norm or veer from what the bureaucrats at least think is the norm. And I was surprised to find that there's also a concern with Buddhist authorities about people moving away from what they think are the norms.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think in the case of the Buddhist community in Maritime Southeast Asia, as I argue in my book, we see a very interesting kind of a shift from the kind of hybrid, or rather what scholars would call popular kind of Buddhist traditions, to more institutional or so-called orthodox, or they call it Zhenxing form of Buddhism in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And it's very interesting because the earlier form of Buddhist practices that the Chinese migrants brought to them when they migrated over to Southeast Asia in the 19th and the early half of the 20th century was a kind of mix of Buddhism with Taoism and also Confucian kind of ancestor worship kind of practices. So to them, they don't see any problem being so-called a Buddhist that pray to Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, worship the Tope Gong or Taoist deities, and at the same time engage in ancestor worship. To them is perfectly okay. And this kind of hybrid practice, in a way, among the Chinese community, they have a belief that the more gods they worship, the more blessings they receive. So there's a saying for that, like 拜得神多神保佑. So to them, it's something that is so normal to them. But it's interesting how ideas of Buddhist reform in Republican China by Buddhist kind of modernists such as Tai Xu and Yin Shun, and how their ideas of reform Buddhism, and one aspect of that was to promote an orthodox Buddhism is based on the kind of Buddhist doctrines, and how these ideas were actually brought to Southeast Asia and contributed to this interesting shift. And my colleague Danielle's newly published book on the kind of Buddhist revitalization in Malaysia actually also talks about this kind of shift, where how reformist Buddhist ideas have, in a way, transformed how Buddhists in the Maritime Southeast Asian religion practice and perceive their religion. So there are kind of Buddhist kind of modernist ideas, in a way, on the one hand, is try to, in a way, package Buddhism as a very rational, very rationalized kind of faith that's relevant and in line with the kind of state discourse of the modern post-colonial nation state. And then on the other hand, the kind of modernist Buddhism has to be in line with the Buddhist doctrine. So we see a very interesting new ways of interpreting what is so-called Buddhism in the region. And also interesting way to think about that is it has a very transnational, transregional angle to it, how these ideas were actually being brought in from China and Taiwan, and how it really transformed the region.
Jack, shall we ask Jake's help to now maybe have audience members join our conversation?
Yes, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah.
So at this point, if there are any questions from the floor, please feel free. You can unmute and show yourself, or you can type in the chat box, and I will read out the questions. So if maybe I will start and ask Jack, how successful have you been in trying to find or collaborate with researchers working on on these Buddhist monks in the other countries in Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I do have collaborators who are working on mainland Southeast Asian Buddhism, but this is something that is, I think, I would say quite new, and something that also I must confess that how humanities and social sciences scholars like myself, we are often used to work like satu orang kind of project with like one man, one person project. So doing kind of collaborations in kind of humanity and social sciences research is also something that's quite new and something that I have been trying to do in the more recent years. And I think it's important for me to have collaborators working on mainland South Asian Buddhism to collaborate and to think about this project more broadly and more regionally. I would say that is the kind of linguistic kind of limitation. When I think one of the advantages I would say when we look at kind of transnational kind of religious practices is that we try to look at it in a more broader kind of more macro perspective. But one of the shortcomings that many of us face is the lack of language and also kind of country knowledge that we need to have in order to study the kind of connection. So having collaborators is actually one of the ways to get around it, especially if, working with fellow colleagues who are able to read the sources and also to have a kind of in-depth country knowledge to in a way collaborate and to communicate with us some of the things that we are not familiar with. So this is something that I have been trying to do in the more recent years, and I hope to be able to offer a more macro way of thinking about this kind of trans-regional South China Sea Buddhism, and also not only the South China Sea region, but also I'm interested to see if that extends across the kind of Indian Ocean as well, to have a more kind of global kind of trans-Asia kind of a Buddhist modernity and kind of networks that happen in the kind of second half of the 20th century. Right. Yeah, thank you, Gail. Thank you for the question.
There was actually somebody I knew who was around my time, who did his postdoc at RENUS, French, and he was looking at Buddhist monks in Burma. I remember him very clearly, but right now I don't remember his name. And I remember him because we were housemates, and also because he was in his presentation about these monks. He was really looking at how they become saints. Mm-hmm. And basically he was just waiting for them to die, because you can't become a saint until you die. Yeah. Which we all found very macabre.
Fascinating. I think he must be probably working on the Weza, which is a kind of a Buddhist kind of wizards in Burma, and they're extremely popular these days.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you're interested, I'll dig up his name.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
But Jack's reply to you, Gaig, was maybe something we could highlight. A lot of transregional work, when work is being done on the Bay of Bengal, on the Indian Ocean, on the South China Sea, I think there is a move towards more and more collaboration between scholars in order to pool resources, pool languages, because it's very, very challenging to do this kind of work, and be able, for instance, to know particular regions, particular places with kind of detailed knowledge, and also be able to think in a much bigger picture perspective. So lots of good Indian Ocean collaborations, I think, across scholarship. So one of the things that's happening as a result of this kind of work, transregional studies, transnational studies, is that I think a body of work is emerging that speaks to individual work as well. So Jack is right, and it's very hard. I think we are different from the sciences. We don't work 10 people on an experiment, and we tend to be doing work individually, but there are ways in which important collaborations are emerging. I think just having this conversation with Jack for me has been very enlightening, and I've learned a lot from listening to Jack, and you learn about different religious traditions, for instance, and maybe someday we'll collaborate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sumit. Yeah, me too. I learned so much from research, and I think it's also interesting to think about this collaboration across religious traditions as well. I think, especially for scholars of religions, we tend to only, in a way, work mainly primarily on our religious traditions, but when we actually look across religion and in a way work comparatively, we actually notice a lot of similarities and actually overlaps across religious traditions. And I think this kind of collaboration would really help us to raise new questions and new ways to think about how religious practices across the Asian region.
So maybe I have a question if there are no hands raised. For people in the audience, you can raise your hand. There's a little hand button. Just click on it and ask a question. But if not, maybe my question is for Sumit and also Jack. So you mentioned that these stories about these people who become who are buried in the keramat only seem to emerge after they die. How long does it take for them to become myths? I mean, how long does it take after they die for these magical stories to emerge? And do you see instances of this with Buddhist monks, Jack?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I think I might have been rushing a little bit, and I didn't mean to say that the stories emerge only after their death. Most of the people who are found in these sites are remembered for an outstanding act of some sort. It could even be a political act. There's a keramat in Aceh who is remembered for the introduction of coffee to Aceh. And so Aceh coffee is not native to Aceh. It was introduced from India, and it became a very important crop in Aceh. And there are various ways, not just acts or feats that are connected to piety. So frequently it's piety. It's someone with enormous discipline and piety who forsakes himself for others, who distributes food to the poor, to children in particular. The keramat of Datuk Koya in Penang is associated with that. And but those are frequently acts that this person carried out when alive. And so many of these figures are really the stories around these figures emerge from the time they're alive, and then they become they grow following their death. And I think the stories then adapt with the times and the circumstances around them. So the story about the distribution of food in the keramat of Koya in Penang remains, and the restaurants in the area, including a very famous nasi kandar restaurant, a particular Indian Muslim specialty, a restaurant called Line Clear, they come to the keramat every Friday with bread to distribute to the poor. So maybe some aspects, some stories outlive others, but most of them, I think, are produced in the time of connected to the figure who is buried there. So in that way, because there's very little historical documentation, written archives on these sites, frequently stories are very interesting revelations.
Yeah. Right.
Over to Jack.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and that's a great question, Kate. I think in the kind of Buddhist context, I think we can think about it in two ways, whether we are looking at popular Buddhism or looking at this kind of institutional, kind of so-called reformist kind of Buddhism. If we think about that more in the case of popular Buddhism, there are many kind of famous eminent monks who, after they died, became kind of Buddhist saints. And for instance, in the Fujian region, some of the very famous monks who became so-called Chinese deities were kind of Qingshui Zhushi and Sangping Zhushi, among others. So these Chinese monks became deities due to two reasons. One was because the local kind of communities claimed that these monks performed miracles after they died and how they contributed to the local community, and that's one thing. But then on the other hand, many of the local communities in a way, they asked the local officials to get support to petition to the emperor, and then the emperor will actually issue official titles to deify those Buddhist monks, and that was also the same way how Chinese deities such as like Mazu or Guangzhou Zhongguo were being deified during the late imperial Chinese period. So many of them were famous people who believed to perform miracles after they died, and then they received titles from the emperors, and then they became kind of deities. But the thing is that when we look at kind of institutional reform kind of Buddhism, then the kind of intellectual, kind of scholarly monks are very against the worship of those so-called kind of deified kind of Buddhist monks or gods. So to them, even for very popular famous monks after they died, for instance, like Tai Shi, after they passed away, his disciples did not really, in a way, deify him, but instead emphasize on the need to promote his teachings, like his doctrine. So it's interesting that how they consider his writing as his kind of Dharma body. They call it the Dharmakaya. So in a way, they see the teachings and the doctrine in a way as more superior than the worship of an eminent religious figure. So we see this very interesting kind of differences. So even in the case of, say, Ashin Jirakita, the monk that I talked about in my presentation, so even though he is in a way being very much respected as the so-called the father of Buddhism in Indonesia, after he passed away, his disciples did not worship him per se, but in a way they remember and commemorate him as a kind of a heroic historical figure. So they will build a museum in a way to commemorate him and his teachings rather than to worship him as a deity. So it's very interesting. When I visited the museum, I saw like his image, and then they have the display of his like relics and also his like his teachings, like his writings, but they did not actually have a kind of a shrine to actually worship him as a deity, which is quite, I would say, very different from the kind of more popular kind of Buddhist tradition. So it's a very interesting way to think about the kind of differences as well, even within the same religious tradition.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Chia. She asks, this question is for Sumit. Is there a connection or shared tradition between Islam and Hinduism with regards to the keramat, as I believe that Pulau Besar in Malacca is frequented by Hindu and Indian Muslim communities?
No, thank you. That's a good question, because when I said that there were layers of religious traditions in many of these sites, in many cases you have possibly not just links to Hinduism, but to animist beliefs. So many keramat, for instance, are also connected to places that Orang Asli, the indigenous people of say, Peninsula Malaysia and indigenous people elsewhere in the region have regarded as a sacred site. So sometimes there's just continuity over time, and there's a layered history to them. Especially to sites like in Pulau Besar that you're referring to, because they are not, the historical documentation around them is weak. Habib Noor, the image I showed you, was a man who lived in the 19th century, and there's actually quite a bit of historical documentation about the man. But in Pulau Besar, there's a lot of, it leaves a lot of the interpretation is open, but we do know that it's a site in which which was very important to the spread of Islam in the region. We know that in broad terms. About why there are many people of Indian descent, Malaysians of Indian descent, who go to Pulau Besar, many who are Muslim and Hindu. Well, it's not just them. Many of these kramats have attracted people of all faiths, all ethnicities, including Chinese. It would probably be take some time to explain why, in particular, Hindus and Indians have Hindu and Muslim Indians from Malaysia tend to go to Pulau Besar now. But I think it's helpful to keep in mind that something Jack said earlier, which is he said it was a Chinese trait, but I would argue it's a trait that's shared across the ethnic groups. To have as many gods on your side as possible is not a bad thing. But that's not how an Islamic body, official body would like it. It's also, interestingly, not necessarily how a Hindu body might like to look at it. Because in each instance, there's a lot of focus on Islam because they are so connected to the state in Indonesia and Malaysia. But various religious authorities try to impose controls. And when those controls are imposed, you find that it becomes less prevalent that people go out in search of a variety of gods to be on, to take their side, so to speak. But Pulau Besar has actually seen a much more diverse crowd of pilgrims, including Chinese in the past. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Jack, you've got a question from Han Xian Liu. So he or she says, I was very intrigued by your discussion of Buddhayana and its attempts to project a more monotheistic image of Buddhism. I'm curious to hear if there were inter-religious dialogues and debates between Buddhist leaders and leading adherents of other religions in the crafting of the Buddhayana doctrine. Were there tensions involved as well?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, there were a lot of tensions involved when Ashin Jarakita came out with this idea of Sangye Apit Buddha. So yes, they were very much involved in the kind of inter-religious dialogues, but I wouldn't say it was a kind of dialogue per se, because Ashin Jarakita had to engage with the kind of Muslim majority population to prove that how Buddhism has this kind of concept of the kind of Almighty God in order to justify how Buddhism was in line with the first principle of Panchasila. And the reason for that was because Ashin Jarakita had to try to make Buddhism in a way in line with the kind of the New Order, kind of Suharto's New Order's anti-communist initiative. And one of the reasons why at that time Suharto wanted all Indonesians at that time in the New Order to have a religious affiliation, because Suharto's government at the time thought that religion could be used as a way to counter the kind of 80s communist influence. So as a result, a lot of the kind of Chinese Indonesians had to declare themselves either as Buddhists or as or any other or Muslim or Christian. So they need to have a religious affiliation. So many Buddhists at that time, in a way, had to had to register themselves as Buddhists in a way in order to prevent themselves from getting into trouble because of the kind of the religious regulation. But at the same time, Ashin Jarakita was very much involved in the kind of inter-religious dialogue, in the sense that how he wanted the Muslim majority population to know that how Buddhists also had this idea of one Almighty God, which was in line with the kind of state discourse. And also this was, he thought, a way to protect the Indonesian Chinese population who declared Buddhism as their religious affiliation. But then on the other hand, there were a lot of tensions and debates among the Buddhist leaders within the Buddhayana movement. And in fact, many of his disciples that were that were from the kind of Theravada Buddhist traditions actually broke away from the Buddhayana movement, because the Buddhayana movement was a kind of a very hybrid kind of Buddhist non-sectarian organization. So the kind of Sangha council consisted of Mahayana, Theravada, and even kind of Vajrayana Buddhist monastics. So the kind of Theravada Buddhist communities and monastic were uncomfortable with Asing Jirakita's idea of finding an upbeat Buddha. So, and as a result, there was a schism within the Sangha community, and some of his disciples broke away and founded the Theravada, the Sangha Theravada Indonesia as a kind of a new Theravada Buddhist organization. And also another very interesting aspect of this tension was actually, in a way, I would say in a way transnational, transregional as well. Because in fact, one of the very prominent Sri Lankan monk, Narada, who propagated Buddhism in Indonesia also in the 50s and 60s, and was a close friend of Asing Jirakita, became very unhappy with his idea. And in fact, he wrote to Asing Jirakita's disciples in a very strongly worded letter. He said that, please tell your teacher that there is no God in Buddhism. So that was in a way quite a in a way I would say how the tension was in a way manifested even transnationally in that sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that too. I was going to ask, but it's this sort of imposing of this monotheistic belief on the minorities, right? Having to conform to that. Any other questions from the audience? Sing Fei?
Yeah.
Calling my student.
Oh.
Can I ask like this?
Sure.
Hi, both speakers. Just now, Dr. Sumit was saying that, well, the communities are not regressive in modern times, and they are not, in a sense, conservative. They are continue to reproduce and produce discourses in order to sustain the keramat. So I would like to ask, could you elaborate more on this? How do these communities or connections across the region, which is a very big topic, how do they sustain themselves in modern times when everything is so fast, right? So that's the very big question. I'm sorry for that, but yeah, some interesting things for me.
No, that's an excellent question. What I suggested was not so much that communities actively come up with stories in order to preserve a keramat, but that it's more like their continued existence as communities change over time, as within the kind of circumstances you describe, even hyper-modern Singapore and so on, there are generations who have linkages to these stories, linkages to a site. And I started off with an anecdote about how Habib Noor, for instance, was able to cure this gentleman's hole in the heart. Right, so he went through a difficult time, and the surgery and so on wasn't necessarily going to work. And the family actually believes that it was Habib Noor, the veneration of Habib Noor, that made the difference. There are numerous stories like that where a shrine is linked to a particular type of miracle. So in this case, health. But let me jump to another quick example to give you a sense of within this very broad, as you say, indeed, a broad topic, how these sites actually generate very interesting stories that are linked to the the moment and the challenges of a particular time. In Cape Town, in South Africa, during apartheid, under apartheid rule, many of these shrines then became a site of seeing intercultural interaction or understanding the world beyond race. So stories emerged not just about the intercultural histories of these shrines, because the shrines, the people buried in the shrines come from distant places. They are often people of very mixed ancestry themselves because of the many travels they made before on their journeys. But these shrines then became connected to anti-apartheid movements, right? So one of the challenges I'll have in trying to talk about this work is how to make sense of all these different kinds of stories that are scattered. And my current solution is actually not to try to create a single narrative. It's to suggest that in a way, it's the concept of a book eventually will be driven by the kind of question you just asked, which is how are the stories what are the stories that circulate? How are they connected to the past and to acts that were performed in the past? What are the particular ways by which a community remembers a site? And you will find that in each of the different contexts I'm looking at, there are different ways and different contemporary developments that invoke the significance of the keramat in the lives of the community members.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that we've only got a minute, so maybe I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask a final question to both our speakers today, which is about the future. Oh, hang on, there's one hand up. Oh, it's a thank you. The question that, oops, I can't seem to. Yulianti, did you want to ask a question? Can you unmute?
Yes, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the opportunity and also for organizing this very interesting event. And I would like to ask a question to Jack. Yeah. Hi, Jack. This is Yulianti. Nice to attend your talk again. It's really.
Thank you. Thanks for your support.
Yeah. So I have just a very quick question because we somehow have studied the same areas like in Indonesia, but I'm mostly working on the Buddhism during the colonial times here. And then in relating to your presentation, I have just a bit curious about when we are talking about the schism within the Sangha. Of the pupil of Asin Dinarakita. So do you think it has something to do with also the growing of the Javanese ethnicity that took interest in Buddhism? Because during the colonial time in my studies, most of Buddhist followers or those who are interested in Buddhism were mostly Chinese Peranakan, and there were only little of the Javanese or other ethnicities of Indonesia. And then in 1950s, it is indicated that there were more of various ethnics that also took interest in Buddhism in Java. So do you think in your research would you assume that it was the schism or disagreement between this bigger, larger community, a Buddhist community, also has something to do with the ethnicities that various ethnics that also take interest in Buddhism? I just would like to know, what would you comment on that? Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your question, Yuli. Yeah, that's a very wonderful question. And yes, okay, during the the post-colonial period, Asian Buddhism, in fact, was playing a very proactive role in converting the Javanese to Buddhists during his kind of Dharma propagation movement. And why? And he actually gave two reasons why he was trying to convert the Javanese to Buddhism. One reason was because he wanted to make Buddhism in Indonesia as diverse as possible. So he wanted the kind of a local, the pre-Bumi, the local kind of population to be Buddhist, so that Buddhism would not be seen as a religion only for the Chinese majority population. But then on the other hand, is one of the reasons why he wanted to convert the Javanese, because he wanted to use the history of Javanese kind of Buddhist connection to the kind of Hindu Buddhist kingdom as a way to justify his kind of religious propagation movement. So that was the reason why he was actually reaching out to a lot of Javanese during his kind of missionary activities. But then in terms of the schism within the Sangha, I would say that the ethnicity did not actually play a very important role. In fact, many of the Buddhists, many of them who actually broke away from the Sangha were his disciples. Some of them were actually ethnic Chinese. So although there were some Javanese as well, but in fact, many of them would they disagree with this idea of the Sangha Abdi Buddha because of their affiliation to the Theravada Buddhist tradition, and not so much because of their ethnicity. So because of that, they disagree with him. And in fact, it's also very important to note that he's one of his most important Javanese lay disciple, Ibu Pratwati, actually stood by and supported him, even though some of the other Buddhist leaders, as I mentioned, like Bhante Narada, was very against this idea of the Sangha Abdi Buddha, and I would say that ethnicity did not really play so much of a role in terms of the split. And later on, it's also interesting that how much later on some of his Chinese disciples also split away from the Buddhayana movement and started the Indonesian. Started the Mahayana Sangha Indonesia, and how this organization actually consisted mainly of Chinese Mahayana monks. So and also that's another case to see how there was actually a split that is actually beyond I would say amnesty, but more had to do with the kind of doctrinal interpretations about what was Orthodox Buddhism and what the Indonesian Buddhist communities were interested in and wanted to practice. So we see this very interesting kind of distinction. Yeah, thanks again, Yuli.
Thank you, Jack, for the very wonderful answer.
So I know it's already 4:35, but because we started late, I'm just gonna ask the final question, and it's a way to follow up with Yuli's question and what Jack said. What is the future of hybrid religions in this region at a time when we can see in Malaysia, a kind of a much more rigid interpretation of Islam, and that kind of Islam creeping into Indonesia as well, and as you kind of hinted, Jack, a much more doctrinal belief in Buddhism. So what's the future of hybrid religions in this region?
Sumit, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, maybe for me, the answer would be looking at the present more closely. You find there are contestations within Muslims about how Islamic practice should take place. And even in terms of, you describe a push towards a more doctrinal Islam, I would be a little bit more, I would think it's not necessarily a push in one direction alone, and that within even, let's say, the trends of people in power in the state, there isn't necessarily an agreement on the kind of Islam that might be proposed. But let me leave it at that with the question of sort of, I'd like to suggest that it's probably a little bit more complicated what's happening in terms of state-led propagation of Islam or particular norms. I think the reason it comes up in your mind, Dick, is a fair one, because national bodies in Malaysia, for instance, that are related to Islam have an enormous budget and have an enormous influence. But I think there's a lot more going on in terms of contestation over the future shape of Islam, and states don't necessarily have all the control. And one thing, but to move on to my own research and looking at how, in many cases, not just the veneration and respect for the histories of keramat, but actual fairly organized pilgrimages to sites in Java, in Aceh, take place that involve Malay Muslims who, in many cases, are being proscribed from such practices within Malaysia. Maybe one of the things I speculate is it's an outlet for them to be able to visit Aceh before COVID on a very cheap flight, and to visit sites there, and in Java, where again there's a very thriving world of pilgrimage practice and a connection to the history of keramats and their miraculous powers, as well as their kind of Sufi underpinnings. If you take the present as any indication, I don't think we're looking at a future in which hybrid religions disappear or hybridity disappears. I think it's an indication of continuing contestation. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I totally agree with Sumit. I think it's in a way, I mean, if we look at that in the kind of the Buddhist context, I think it's important thing about, in fact, the relationships between the so-called modernist and reformist monks and the kind of hybrid Buddhist temples across Maritime Southeast Asia. I mean, on the one hand, we see how this kind of modernist reformist monks, how they try to promote their visions of so-called Buddhist orthodoxy by setting themselves apart from so-called hybrid Buddhist practices in terms of their kind of Dharma propagation, in terms of their promotion of Buddhist doctrines. But on the other hand, we actually, in fact, from my fieldwork, I actually have observed that a lot of the Chinese Buddhists, they have actually participated and in fact moved quite freely between this kind of modernist Buddhist organization and this kind of hybrid Buddhist temples without, oftentimes without having to give up one over the other. And I think it's one of the reasons for that is that we have to think about how, for instance, when we look at the Chinese community in Maritime Southeast Asia, we often see how the Chinese community often have very much of the overlapping kind of commercial, clan, and kind of family ties across the region that is just perhaps just difficult to have a very clear-cut kind of separation between kind of modernist kind of reform ideas and this kind of hybrid Buddhist practices. But I think something very interesting and important that Sumit also raised in his earlier presentation, I think, is about this idea of miracles. And I would say that this idea of miracles and this kind of social reproductions of miracle stories continue to be very important in this kind of hybrid religious organizations. And precisely because of that, there are always religious followers that would visit these temples for their kind of perceived efficacy and kind of religious power and magic that is just cannot be in a way easily eradicated through the emergence of a very rationalized kind of scientific form of religious ideas and practices. So in other words, I think hybrid religious organizations are here to stay. But then on the other hand, I think it's very likely that we're going to see how hybrid kind of more, I would say, pre-institutional Buddhist organizations are in fact going to rely on more, say, social media or technology to promote their ideas. So we're going to see that how this organization, in fact, are going to promote and package themselves in a very modern way. That and especially especially during this period of, I think, COVID-19, I think over the Asian Research Institute over at NUS, there's a kind of a blog series called the Korasu, I think, that talks about religion and religion and COVID-19, and many blog posts actually talk about the use of technology across religious tradition in Asia. And in fact, we see a lot of the local kind of like even spirit media temples and kind of a local shrines are using technology to continue their activities during this period of pandemic. So I think this is interesting to think about hybrid religion in such a way.
Thank you. I mean, this is very interesting because I teach a class on post-humanism where, and next semester I teach a class on post-colonialism where we challenge notions of modernity and secularism and Western liberal, humanism. And here you have, technology and religion together with kind of magic and reason, or magic challenging reason. So I think on that note, on that kind of very open note, I would like to leave and thank you both for a very enlightening talk. And I hope that our viewers will look out for other events in future and join us. But yeah, let's thank everybody. And Sumit, do you think it's possible to take some kind of picture?
I can't get all three of us on one screen. I wanted to thank you and to thank the audience as well. So thanks to everyone who's joined us.
Yeah, and thanks again, Kate and Sumit, for having me.
Oh no, you're most welcome. Okay, so maybe we won't have a photograph, but we will have the recording, and we will put it up on our YouTube, on the Unari YouTube. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.